Section 1 of The Diary of a Russian Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Shrimpfish. The Diary of a Russian Lady by Barbara Doukhovsky. Early Recollections. My father, Prince Theodore Galitzine, married my mother, being a widower with 5 children, 3 of whom died before my birth. My earliest vivid recollections began when I was 2 years old. I distinctly remember feeling a terrible pain in parting with my wet nurse, to whom I was passionately attached. I got hold of her skirt and wouldn't let her go, weeping wildly. It was my first bitter affliction. I could not put up with the new nurse, whom I hated from the depths of my little heart, and I would not call her otherwise than Wild Cat, with baby petulance, having already at that early age pronounced likes and dislikes. We were in perpetual state of warfare. When I was about 3 years old, that nurse was succeeded by a pretty Belgian girl named Mlle Henriette. The tutor of my 2 step-brothers, Mr. Lizier, made love to her and finished by marrying her some time after. He seemed somewhat half-witted. By night he went to chime the bells at the belfry of our village church in Dolgik, a fine estate belonging to my father, in the government of Kharkov, and also amused himself by breaking, in the conservatory, the panes of glass with big stones. One day he frightened his sweetheart nearly to death by throwing a snake under her feet. After all these pranks, it is no way astonishing that Mr. Lizier finished his days in a lunatic asylum. The tutor who succeeded him asked my parents to bring his wife with him. He hastened to pocket the 100 roubles taken beforehand, on account of his salary, and departed suddenly to Kharkov to fetch her. Meanwhile my father received a letter from this tutor's legitimate wife, dated from St. Petersburg, in which she entreated Papa to send her the half of her husband's monthly salary, telling him he spent all his money on his mistress, whilst his wife and children had not a morsel of bread to put into their mouths. Of course, this too Don Juanesque tutor was instantly dismissed. My parents at that time kept an open house. On great occasions my smart nurse would appear in the dining-room carrying me in her arms, attired like a little fairy, all ribbons and lace, to be admired by our guests. She put me down on the table, and I promenaded quite at my ease between the flowers and fruits. I was born under fortunate auspices. There could not be a happier little girl. Good things were thrown down upon me, presents, petting, admiration. At an early age I chose as my motto, Fais ce que voudras. Whatever I wished for I very certainly had, and I didn't see how anybody could want to refuse me in anything. I was often sent down to the drawing-room to be admired by the afternoon callers, and Mamma ordered me to let myself be kissed by unkissable grown-ups, who paid me those compliments shown to children who are precious to their parents, and which made me intolerably conceited. I stood in great danger of being completely spoilt, and Mamma, who was afraid that I received a good deal more flattery than she thought good for me, ordered me to answer what I was told. Comme Vava est jolie. Vava n'est pas jolie, elle est seulement gentille. But nevertheless I knew that I was pretty. My glass told me so. At the age of 4 I could read and write fairly well, and chatted freely in French. I was immensely proud when my nurse ended putting me to bed in the daytime, and when I was old enough to sit at table, able to handle my knife and fork properly. My greatest delight was to ride on my brothers' backs and to be swung by them in a sheet that they held by the 4 corners, and lifted me as high as they could, whilst I crowed gleefully, my bare legs waving happily in the air. Mamma hastened with my nurse to my rescue, and carried me off, paying but little attention to the wild shrieks with which I requested to be tossed higher and higher. There was a speedy end to all this fun. Destiny itself interfered to stop these aerial gymnastics. I had a bad fall one day, tumbling out of the sheet, and my infatuation for this sport disappeared completely. It was a source of infinite delight to me to creep on the knees of Mr. Vremnev, an intimate friend of my parents, a charming old gentleman with snowy white hair, and hear him relate entrancing fairy tales for which I had an insatiable appetite. As soon as he had finished one story, I asked for another, and another, At that time my father was Marshal of Nobility of the district of Kharkov. One day he was suddenly called to St. Petersburg, and during his absence we received the news that he was appointed Chamberlain to His Majesty the Emperor. I wept bitterly when I was told that Papa must wear the Chamberlain's key, persuaded that he would be obliged to adorn even his robe de chambre with that ugly ornament, which must completely transform my dear old dad. My parents, going to St. Petersburg, generally paid flying visits to my Aunt Galitzine, who lived in Moscow. I made my first journey with them at the mature age of 4. If the faults of children develop as they grow older, I was to become a pickpocket, for I had the bad habit of hiding in my pockets all sorts of broken toys belonging to the Karamzins, 2 little pupils of my aunt. When I went to bed, my nurse emptied my pockets, crying out at the enormity of my dreadful conduct. My birthday was a great day for festivities. I received lots of lovely presents and sweets. On the eve of my birthday I went to bed with expectations of a pleasant awaking, and the first thing when I woke up in the morning was to put my hand under my pillow and pull out the presents laid there by my parents during my sleep. On my 7th birthday my grandmother presented me with a beautiful watch with diamond settings. From the very first moment I harbored a guilty determination to get the diamonds out, just as I broke my dolls' heads in order to see what there was in them, a resolve, alas, very soon put into practice. Mamma, entering my nursery one day, saw me perched on the top of my high stool, occupied in drawing out the diamonds with a long pin. Moral: it is superfluous to give such rich presents to small persons of my age. The object of my first love was a simple servant girl who lived in the next house. Every day I watched for her, and rushing to the window I flattened my tiny nose against the glass, and devoured her with eager eyes. We used to live in Kharkov in winter, and pass the summer months in Doljik, our beautiful estate which claims to be counted amongst the stately homes of Russia, situated 40 miles distant from town. Our removal to Doljik was a regular treat for us children, our joy and the servants' nuisance, for when they began to pack up, we were only in their way, under pretense of help, poking about among the straw scattered in the yard, throwing it over one another whilst playing hide-and-seek. Doljik is a delightful place. The castle, a stately white mansion of commanding appearance, is very grand with its suite of lofty rooms. Portraits of ancestors, the former Galitzines, very good-looking all of them, adorn the walls. The park is beautiful, with long alleys of elm and oak, and vast lawns with skilfully sorted flower borders. I had a doll's house in the park, furnished with every convenience, with a garden of my own in which I spent happy hours gardening eagerly, weeding and watering. I also bestowed a great part of my affection on pet animals, dogs, cats, squirrels, and tame rabbits. My brothers and I were fond of all kinds of fun. Early in the morning we used to start for the meadows with baskets to gather mushrooms for our breakfast, and went for rambles in the woods. We also did a lot of fishing and bathing. My parents presented me with a perfect dream of a pony. How proud I felt when I was lifted on my Scotchie's back for my first ride. Dolls took no leading part in my childhood, and I had often wished I had been a boy. I climbed trees and tore my frocks, and engaged in all sorts of wild pranks. There was much excitement on my father's birthday. The house was full of guests, and an orchestra came down from town. At dinner, when Papa's health was drunk, 2 large cannons, placed at the principal entrance, were fired, which made me crawl on my hands and knees shamefully under the table. We had in the evening grand illuminations in the park, with fireworks which did not enrapture me, for at every burst of rockets I had to put my hands over my ears. On the day of our village festival, there was a fair on the square opposite the church. I threw sugar candy and handfuls of pennies to the peasant children. I had now passed my 8th year, and the time for lessons had come. I was given over to the care of a French governess, Mlle Rose, who was very badly named, for she was a horrid lemon-colored old creature, wearing a hideous curled wig, and always looking as though she had just swallowed a spoonful of vinegar. I hated plain people about me, and could not bear the sight of Mlle Rose, disliking her from the first. What a life I led her! Plaguing her was a charmingly pretty sport for me. My governess was always scolding and fault-finding. She forced me to make her every morning and evening a low curtsy, which made me long to kick her. Mlle Rose held up as an example to me a little friend of mine, the Princess Mimi Trubetskoy, who was a well-behaved child, doing credit to her governess's bringing up, and never giving her any trouble. But I despised sheep-like docility, and was weary of hearing of all the beautiful things Mimi did and said. Being deprived of the bump of respect, I did exactly what my governess told me not to, refusing to be put into harness. When the fighting blood stirred in me and made me too horribly naughty, I was sent for punishment to bed, but I would rather be cut to pieces before I would deign to apologize to Melrose. That disagreeable person was succeeded by Mlle Allemande, a French lady educated in England, the most delightful of old maids, whom I loved fondly, for she was never cross, and since she came to me I began to understand that it was possible for a governess to be nice, and that the term is not necessarily synonymous to frighten and bore. We got on very well, for Mlle Allemande bore with my caprices, which were many, I must confess, but though she was always in a good temper, we had little quarrels sometimes, which we soon made up. I studied my piano with Mlle Allemande, and learned English, which soon became a second mother tongue to me. When we went out walking, my governess's soft heart was full of pity for the poor starving homeless dogs, which she picked up in the streets and brought home to be fed. The ugliest and shabbiest had her tenderest care. Mlle Allemande was called back to England, and my parents had to get another governess. An English young lady was engaged, named Miss Emily Puddin. My brothers made her rage awfully in calling her Miss Pudding. She had no authority over me whatever, being in fact rather silly, but she was a very pleasant companion, so well up in all games. We were enthusiastic croquet players, and had sometimes desperate quarrels, being very near scratching each other's eyes out. "I tell you I hit your ball!" "You didn't!" "I did!" etc., our arguments becoming very hot and uncivil. Soon we dropped our mallets and ran, and complained to mamma, both governess and pupil. When I was past my 12th year, I grew very fond of reading the books of the Bibliothèque Rose. I pitied mamma because she read deadly uninteresting English Tauchnitz novels, when there existed such enrapturing books as Les Petites Filles Modèles, Les Malheurs de Sophie, etc. But this childish literature did not hinder me from flirtation. I used to long for adventures, and here I was just having one, notwithstanding that I had only just grown out of pinafores. My parents took me sometimes to the Italian opera, and I conceived a romantic admiration for the tenor of the troupe, who was, as I thought, adorable beyond words. I raved about him. When out walking with my governess, I dragged her in the direction I knew the tenor would take, in the hope of meeting him. I began to knit a prosaic cache-nez for the object of my dreams, which mamma confiscated, happily, in time. From my earliest years I had a great love for acting. We gave, from time to time, little theatrical entertainments. We dressed up and played fragments of Shakespeare's dramas, and I was the leading lady in these rehearsals. When I took up the high tragic part of Desdemona, Nicholas, the brother of my little friend Sophie Annenkopf, was the personator of Othello. He sacrificed his appearance so far as to blacken his face. During the murder scene, when the situation grew particularly tragic, Nicholas displayed such a realism of the Shakespearean meaning that I began to fear being choked in reality. I was a half-grown girl now, arrived at the age of 14, envied awfully by my friends, the Countess Sievers and Mary Podgoricini, who were grown-ups and wore long frocks. "Some day," I said, "it will be my turn to be introduced to society." I looked forward to the day when I should reach the age of 17 and appear at my first ball with a long train, and be able to flirt to my heart's content. I felt now that I had enough of governesses. My last one, Mlle Anagai, bored me awfully, being extremely particular about my manners. It was preach, preach all day long. Mlle Anna gave me continually a string of instructions consisting chiefly of don'ts, which I listened to impatiently. I couldn't go here, I couldn't go there, I couldn't eat this, I couldn't eat that. My governess was indeed too exasperating, and I had a furious inclination to consign her to very warm quarters. Mlle Anna was besides intensely devout, being very anxious about the welfare of my soul. She crammed me with pious lectures, but books of this sort were not in my line, and I read everything I could lay hand on. Papa's library was full of interesting books, and I spent whole nights greedily devouring in bed works written by Paul de Kock, a jolly author, but rather improper. In the morning I hid these books under my mattress. My childhood's days had passed by. Poor Bibliothèque Rose, thy time was well and duly over. End of section 1.